What is literary theory? Literary theory, sometimes designated critical theory, or theory, and now undergoing a transformation into cultural theory, within the discipline of literary studies, can be understood as the set of concepts and intellectual assumptions on which rests the work of explaining or interpreting literary texts. Literary theory refers to any principles derived from internal analysis of literary texts or from knowledge external to the text that can be applied in multiple interpretive situations. All critical practice regarding literature depends on an underlying structure of ideas in at least two ways. Theory provides a rationale for what constitutes the subject matter of criticism, the literary, and the specific aims of critical practice, the act of interpretation itself. For example, to speak of the unity of Oedipus, the king explicitly invokes Aristotle's theoretical statements on poetics. To argue, as does Chinua Achebe, that Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness fails to grant full humanity to the Africans it depicts is a perspective informed by a post-colonial literary theory that presupposes a history of exploitation and racism. Critics that explain the climactic drowning of Edna Pontellier in The Awakening as a suicide generally call upon a supporting architecture of feminist and gender theory. The structure of ideas that enables criticism of a literary work may or may not be acknowledged by the critic, and the status of literary theory within the academic discipline of literary studies continues to evolve. Literary theory and the formal practice of literary interpretation runs a parallel but less well-known course with the history of philosophy and is evident in the historical record at least as far back as Plato. The Cratylus contains a Plato's meditation on the relationship of words and the things to which they refer. Plato's skepticism about signification, i.e., that words bear no etymological relationship to their meanings but are arbitrarily imposed, becomes a central concern in the 20th century to both structuralism and post-structuralism. However, a persistent belief in reference, the notion that words and images refer to an objective reality, has provided epistemological, that is, having to do with theories of knowledge, support for theories of literary representation throughout most of Western history. Until the 19th century, art, in Shakespeare's phrase, held a mirror up to nature, and faithfully recorded an objectively real world independent of the observer. Modern literary theory gradually emerges in Europe during the 19th century. In one of the earliest developments of literary theory, German higher criticism subjected biblical texts to a radical historicizing that broke with traditional scriptural interpretation. Higher, or source criticism, analyzed biblical tales in light of comparable narratives from other cultures, an approach that anticipated some of the method and spirit of 20th century theory, particularly structuralism. Attention to the etymology of the term theory, from the Greek theoria, alerts us to the partial nature of theoretical approaches to literature. Theoria indicates a view or perspective of the Greek stage. This is precisely what literary theory offers, though specific theories often claim to present a complete system for understanding literature. The current state of theory is such that there are many overlapping areas of influence, and older schools of theory, though no longer enjoying their previous eminence, continue to exert an influence on the whole. The once widely held conviction, an implicit theory, that literature is a repository of all that is meaningful and ennobling in the human experience, a view championed by the Levis School in Britain, may no longer be acknowledged by name but remains an essential justification for the current structure of American universities and liberal arts curricula. The moment of deconstruction may have passed, but its emphasis on the indeterminacy of signs, that we are unable to establish exclusively what a word means when used in a given situation, and thus of texts, remains significant. Many critics may not embrace the label feminist, but the premise that gender is a social construct, one of theoretical feminism's distinguishing insights, is now axiomatic in a number of theoretical perspectives. While literary theory has always implied or directly expressed a conception of the world outside the text, in the 20th century. The new criticism, so designated as to indicate a break with traditional methods, was a product of the American university in the 1930s and 40s. New criticism stressed close reading of the text itself, much like the French pedagogical precept explication du texte. As a strategy of reading, new criticism viewed the work of literature as an aesthetic object independent of historical context and as a unified whole that reflected the unified sensibility of the artist. T.S. Eliot, though not explicitly associated with the movement, expressed a similar critical aesthetic philosophy in his essays on John Donne and the metaphysical poets, writers who Eliot believed experienced a complete integration of thought and feeling. New critics like Clent Brooks, John Crowe Ransom, Robert Penn Warren and W. K. Wimsatt placed a similar focus on the metaphysical poets and poetry in general, a genre well suited to new critical practice. New criticism aimed at bringing a greater intellectual rigor to literary studies, confining itself to careful scrutiny of the text alone and the formal structures of paradox, ambiguity, irony, and metaphor, among others. New criticism was fired by the conviction that their readings of poetry would yield a humanizing influence on readers and thus counter the alienating tendencies of modern, industrial life. New criticism, in this regard, bears an affinity to the Southern agrarian movement. Marxism and critical theory. Marxist literary theories tend to focus on the representation of class conflict as well as the reinforcement of class distinctions through the medium of literature. Marxist theorists use traditional techniques of literary analysis but subordinate aesthetic concerns to the final social and political meanings of literature. Marxist theorists often champion authors sympathetic to the working classes and authors whose work challenges economic equalities found in capitalist societies. In keeping with the totalizing spirit of Marxism, literary theories arising from the Marxist paradigm have not only sought new ways of understanding the relationship between economic production and literature, but all cultural production as well. Marxist analyses of society and history have had a profound effect on literary theory and practical criticism, most notably in the development of new historicism and cultural materialism. The Hungarian theorist George Lukács contributed to an understanding of the relationship between historical materialism and literary form, in particular with realism and the historical novel. Walter Benjamin broke new ground in his work in his study of aesthetics and the reproduction of the work of art. The Frankfurt School of philosophers, including most notably Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse, after their emigration to the United States, played a key role in introducing Marxist assessments of culture into the mainstream. The major Marxist influences on literary theory since the Frankfurt School have been Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton in Great Britain and Frank Lantricchia and Fredric Jameson in the United States. Williams is associated with the New Left political movement in Great Britain and the development of cultural materialism and the cultural studies movement, originating in the 1960s at Birmingham University's Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Eagleton is known both as a Marxist theorist and as a popularizer of theory by means of his widely read overview, Literary Theory. Lantricchia likewise became influential through his account of trends in theory, after the new criticism. Jameson is a more diverse theorist, known both for his impact on Marxist theories of culture and for his position as one of the leading figures in theoretical postmodernism. Jameson's work on consumer culture, architecture, film, literature and other areas, typifies the collapse of disciplinary boundaries taking place in the realm of Marxist and postmodern cultural theory. Jameson's work investigates the way the structural features of late capitalism, particularly the transformation of all culture into commodity form, are now deeply embedded in all of our ways of communicating. Lacanian psychoanalysis, an updating of the work of Sigmund Freud, extends post-structuralism to the human subject with further consequences for literary theory. According to Lacan, the fixed, stable self is a romantic fiction, like the text in Deconstruction, the self is a disintegrated mass of traces left by our encounter with signs, visual symbols, language, etc. For Lacan, the self is constituted by language, a language that is never one's own, always another's, always already in use. Barthes supplies these currents of thought in his famous declaration of the death of the author. Writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin, while also applying a similar, post-structuralist, view to the reader. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Michel Foucault is another philosopher, like Barthes, whose ideas inform much of post-structuralist literary theory. Foucault played a critical role in the development of the postmodern perspective that knowledge is constructed in concrete historical situations in the form of discourse. Knowledge is not communicated by discourse but is discourse itself, can only be encountered textually. Following Nietzsche, Foucault performs what he calls genealogies, attempts at deconstructing the unacknowledged operation of power and knowledge to reveal ideologies that make domination of one group. Louis Montrose, another major innovator and exponent of New Historicism, describes a fundamental axiom of the movement as an intellectual belief in the textuality of history and the historicity of texts. New Historicism draws on the work of Levi Strauss, in particular his notion of culture as a self-regulating system. The Foucauldian premise that power is ubiquitous and cannot be equated with state or economic power and Gramsci's conception of hegemony, i.e., that domination is often achieved through culturally orchestrated consent rather than force, are critical underpinnings to the New Historicist perspective. The translation of the work of Mikhail Bakhtin on Carnival coincided with the rise of the New Historicism and cultural materialism, and left a legacy in work of other theorists of influence like Peter Stahlebras and Jonathan Dollimore. In its period of ascendancy during the 1980s, New Historicism drew criticism from the political left for its depiction of countercultural expression as always co-opted by the dominant discourses. Equally, New Historicism's lack of emphasis on literariness and formal literary concerns brought disdain from traditional literary scholars. However, New Historicism continues to exercise a major influence in the humanities and in the extended conception of literary studies. Though not the first writer to explore the historical condition of postcolonialism, the Palestinian literary theorist Edward Said's book Orientalism is generally regarded as having inaugurated the field of explicitly postcolonial criticism in the West. Said argues that the concept of the Orient was produced by the imaginative geography of Western scholarship and has been instrumental in the colonization and domination of non-Western societies. Postcolonial theory reverses the historical center/margin direction of cultural inquiry. Critiques of the metropolis and capital now emanate from the former colonies. Moreover, theorists like Homi K. Bhabha have questioned the binary thought that produces the dichotomies, center/margin, white/black, and colonizer/colonized, by which colonial practices are justified. The work of Gayatri C. Spivak has focused attention on the question of who speaks for the colonial other, and the relation of the ownership of discourse and representation to the development of the postcolonial subjectivity. Like feminist and ethnic theory, postcolonial criticism pursues not merely the inclusion of the marginalized literature of colonial peoples into the dominant canon and discourse. Postcolonial criticism offers a fundamental critique of the ideology of colonial domination and at the same time seeks to undo the imaginative geography of Orientalist thought that produced conceptual as well as economic divides between West and East, civilized. Ethnic studies and postcolonial criticism. Ethnic studies, sometimes referred to as minority studies, has an obvious historical relationship with postcolonial criticism in that Euro-American imperialism and colonization in the last 4 centuries, whether external, empire, or internal, slavery, has been directed at recognizable ethnic groups, African and African American, Chinese, the subaltern peoples of India, Irish, Latino, Native American, and Filipino, among others. Ethnic studies concerns itself generally with art and literature produced by identifiable ethnic groups either marginalized or in a subordinate position to a dominant culture. Post-colonial criticism investigates the relationships between colonizers and colonized in the period post-colonization. Though the two fields are increasingly finding points of intersection, the work of bell hooks, for example, and are both activist intellectual enterprises, ethnic studies and post-colonial criticism, have significant differences in their history and ideas. Ethnic studies has had a considerable impact on literary studies in the United States and Britain. In W. E. B. Du Bois, we find an early attempt to theorize the position of African Americans within dominant white culture through his concept of double consciousness, a dual identity including both American and Negro. Du Bois and theorists after him seek an understanding of how that double experience both creates identity and reveals itself in culture. Gender studies and queer theory. Gender theory came to the forefront of the theoretical scene first as feminist theory but has subsequently come to include the investigation of all gender and sexual categories and identities. Feminist gender theory followed slightly behind the re-emergence of political feminism in the United States and Western Europe during the 1960s. Political feminism of the so-called second wave had as its emphasis practical concerns with the rights of women in contemporary societies, women's identity, and the representation of women in media and culture. These causes converged with early literary feminist practice, characterized by Elaine Showalter as gynocriticism, which emphasized the study and canonical inclusion of works by female authors as well as the depiction of women in male-authored canonical texts. Feminist gender theory is postmodern in that it challenges the paradigms and intellectual premises of Western thought, but also takes an activist stance by proposing frequent interventions and alternative epistemological positions meant to change the social order. In the context of postmodernism, gender theorists, led by the work of Judith Butler, initially viewed the category of gender as a human construct enacted by a vast repetition of social performance. The biological distinction between man and woman eventually came under the same scrutiny by theorists who reached a similar conclusion: the sexual categories are products of culture. Masculine gender theory as a separate enterprise has focused largely on social, literary, and historical accounts of the construction of male gender identities. Such work generally lacks feminism's activist stance and tends to serve primarily as an indictment rather than a validation of male gender practices and masculinity. The so-called men's movement, inspired by the work of Robert Bly among others, was more practical than theoretical and has had only limited impact on gender discourse. The impetus for the men's movement came largely as a response to the critique of masculinity and male domination that runs throughout feminism and the upheaval of the 1960s, a period of crisis in American social ideology that has required a reconsideration of gender roles. Having long served as the de facto subject of Western thought, male identity and masculine gender theory await serious investigation as a particular, and no longer universally representative, field of inquiry. Much of what theoretical energy of masculine gender theory currently possesses comes from its ambiguous relationship with the field of queer theory. Queer theory is not synonymous with gender theory, nor even with the overlapping fields of gay and lesbian studies, but does share many of their concerns with normative definitions of man, woman, and sexuality. Queer theory questions the fixed categories of sexual identity and the cognitive paradigms generated by normative cultural studies. Much of the intellectual legacy of New Historicism and cultural materialism can now be felt in the cultural studies movement in departments of literature, a movement not identifiable in terms of a single theoretical school, but one that embraces a wide array of perspectives: media studies, social criticism, anthropology, and literary theory, as they apply to the general study of culture. Cultural studies arose quite self-consciously in the 80s to provide a means of analysis of the rapidly expanding global culture industry that includes entertainment, advertising, publishing, television, film, computers, and the Internet. Cultural studies brings scrutiny not only to these varied categories of culture, and not only to the decreasing margins of difference between these realms of expression, but just as importantly to the politics and ideology that make contemporary culture possible. Cultural studies became notorious in the 90s for its emphasis on pop music icons and music video in place of canonical literature, and extends the ideas of the Frankfurt School on the transition from a truly popular culture to mass culture in late capitalist societies, emphasizing the significance of the patterns of consumption of cultural artifacts. Cultural studies has been interdisciplinary, even antidisciplinary, from its inception. Indeed, cultural studies can be understood as a set of sometimes conflicting methods and approaches applied to a question.